To the people of Halter's Ridge, Albert Granger was as much a fixture of the town as the rusted grain silos or the old train crossing that hadn't seen a locomotive in years. Every weekday morning at exactly 7:12 a.m., his yellow school bus would appear over the hill, headlights cutting through the early fog like clockwork. He never honked. He didn't have to. The kids would already be waiting, backpacks slung over one shoulder, sneakers scuffing the pavement. As they lined up, Mr. Granger, they called him, never Al, never Bert, just Mr. Granger, always with a nod, always on time. He wasn't a man of many words, but the few he offered were kind, polite, worn soft by time. He kept a photograph of his late wife Eleanor tucked behind the sun visor, a quiet smile forever frozen in a frame of dusty plastic. Cancer had taken her 8 years earlier, and though Albert never spoke about it, there was something in the way he glanced at that photo at every stop sign that made you feel the silence carried weight. They had no children, no siblings still living. Just Albert, the bus, and the house on Willow Street with the sagging porch swing that creaked in the wind. At 71, Albert should have retired, but he didn't. Maybe he didn't want to. Driving the route gave his day's structure, purpose, something to do between morning coffee and evening radio static. His record was spotless. Not a single complaint in 32 years. No drinking, no debts, no drama. He was the kind of man who brought apple slices to the kindergartners and tightened loose bolts on playground swings on his lunch break. So when Albert Granger vanished on a Monday afternoon in October 1992, it didn't just unsettle the town, it shook something deeper. This was a man who did everything right, who never veered off schedule, who had no reason to disappear. There were no enemies, no secrets, no loose ends, just a quiet, decent man with a bus full of empty seats and a promise to return. But he never did. It was a cold, brittle kind of morning, the kind where the frost clings stubbornly to windshields and breath clouds linger just a little longer in the air. October 12th, 1992. A Monday. The leaves had just begun to turn, bleeding gold and rust along the winding roads of Halter's Ridge. The day began like every other. Albert Granger rolled the district's bus number 38 out of the depot at 6:45 a.m., same as always. He stopped at the convenience store on Spruce Street for a thermos refill, black coffee, no sugar, and exchanged a few pleasantries with the cashier Gloria, who would later tell police there was nothing strange about him. Calm as ever, she said, smiled with his eyes. By 8 a.m., every student had been dropped at Halter's Ridge Elementary. A dozen kids, give or take, all accounted for. No incidents, no mechanical issues. The bus was due back at the depot by 8:30, where Albert usually parked, did a once-over inspection, logged mileage, and took his lunch back home. But that morning, bus number 38 didn't return. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. Calls were made, radios checked, nothing. By 10 a.m., the town mechanic, Carl Jennings, was dispatched along Albert's regular return route. He found no skid marks, no debris, no sign of trouble. Just silence. The official search began at noon. State Patrol, county deputies, even a chopper from neighboring Devlin County. The entire return route was barely 18 miles of mostly straight road with 2 stop signs and a yield. There were no witnesses, no reported breakdowns, no strange sightings. It was like the bus had slipped through the cracks in the world, like it had been erased. At 3:20 p.m., school officials called every parent. A few kids cried. Most didn't understand. To them, Mr. Granger was just a driver. To the adults, his absence was like a thread pulled from a sweater, something small but unraveling. By dusk, volunteers with flashlights combed the fields, the tree lines, the riverside curves, and still nothing. No tracks, no oil leaks, no glass, no bus, no driver. Albert Granger had vanished, without a struggle, without a sound, somewhere between Halter's Ridge Elementary and the depot. The last known person to see him was a second grader named Lily Peterson. She waved to him through the back window as she ran up the school steps. He waved back, she said. Then he was gone. By nightfall on October 12, 1992, the only thing more unsettling than the absence of bus number 38 was the absence of anything explaining it. The route was simple. Leave the school, take Mill Creek Road for 12 miles, then cut through Hemlock Pass and drop the bus at the depot just past the lumber yard. Every mile of it was paved, flat, and wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass without touching mirrors. It wasn't a place where things went missing. But somehow, a 35-foot school bus and the man driving it had disappeared as if swallowed by the earth itself. Authorities initially assumed a mechanical failure, maybe a breakdown, a dead battery, or a flat tire. But no emergency call came in, no distress signal. And Granger was known to carry a CB radio, always tuned to Channel 19 in case of trouble. The dispatcher tried repeatedly to reach him that morning. Static, no response, not even a click. Sheriff's deputies traced the entire return route on foot, horseback, and by ATV. Aerial scans were deployed. They checked ravines, pulled back brush, and inspected culverts. No oil slicks, no torn branches, no torn fabric on barbed wire. The road looked untouched, just a quiet stretch of rural highway framed by thick timber and the kind of silence that settles when something has gone terribly wrong. It wasn't an abduction. There were no tire marks leading away from the road, no sign of pursuit, no evidence of struggle. It wasn't theft. The buses were tracked by serial number, and nothing turned up at chop shops or scrap yards. Even the nearby junkyard owner, a man with little love for law enforcement, voluntarily opened his gates. Nothing. Within 24 hours, the case turned from a missing persons report into something stranger. There was no ransom, no message, no motive. A man and a machine had vanished in broad daylight on a route he'd driven hundreds of times. At the edge of town, the depot lights stayed on late into the night. A fresh pot of coffee was brewed every hour. And parked beside Bay 3 was another bus, untouched, with the name Halters Ridge School District printed in block letters across its side. Next to it was an empty space where bus number 38 should have been. It would stay empty for the next 20 years. By sunrise on October 13th, the entire town knew. Halters Ridge wasn't the kind of place where news traveled slowly. It moved like a fire through dry brush. Church bells didn't ring that morning, but it felt like they had. You could feel it in the air, the weight, the wrongness. Albert Granger was missing, and no one could understand how. At Doris's Diner, nobody touched their pancakes. Men in trucker hats sat in silence, hands wrapped around steaming mugs, eyes locked on nothing in particular. At the post office, the regular mail drop was late. Across town, the gas station's out-of-order sign stayed taped to pump too long after the tank had been repaired. Everyone was moving, but no one felt present. Something had broken. Something had been taken. At the elementary school, students were pulled aside by counselors. Some cried. Others just asked, "When is Mr. Granger coming back?" No one had an answer. A few of the older kids tried to act like it was just a weird day. But even they looked out the windows longer than usual, watching for yellow paint through the trees. By noon, locals had organized. Not officially, not yet, but you didn't need a badge to care. Volunteers formed groups, divvied up maps, and packed thermoses and flashlights. People with no formal training grabbed boots, jackets, and old compasses. They didn't wait for orders. They just started walking. Barns were searched, old wells opened, lake edges combed with fishing poles and ropes tied to tires. Sheriff Howard Jacobs gave a short press statement that afternoon, standing stiffly in front of the courthouse. "We are doing everything we can to locate Mr. Granger. As of this time, there is no evidence of foul play, but all possibilities are being considered." He didn't take questions. He looked tired. So did everyone else. That night, a candlelight vigil was held in front of the depot. Nearly 300 people showed up. Some held photos of Albert, others held hands. No one spoke above a whisper. As the final flame flickered out, a local preacher said quietly, "May the road rise up to meet him." But there was no road, no sign, just a blank space where certainty used to live. The search began in earnest before the frost had melted off the fields. By dawn on October 13th, sheriff's deputies, state troopers, and a handful of volunteer firefighters had created a crude command center just outside town, using the local VFW hall as their staging ground. Maps were taped to walls, routes were highlighted in thick red marker. Radios chirped endlessly, voices calm but clipped. Everyone moving with the quiet urgency of people who didn't want to admit the worst might already have happened. They started with the obvious, retracing every inch of the return route from Halters Ridge Elementary to the depot. It took 4 hours. Nothing. No fresh tire marks. No sign of a skid. No shattered glass or scraped guardrails. Just pavement and trees and silence. By noon, searchers began to widen the perimeter. Roads became trails, trails became deer paths, and soon volunteers were bushwhacking through thickets with machetes, calling Albert's name into the wind. Helicopters joined the effort by 2 p.m., their rotors thrumming low over tree canopies and open fields. Dive teams were brought in to scan local ponds and watering holes. Dogs were deployed, trained to sniff out engine oil, gasoline, decomposition. They picked up nothing. It was like chasing smoke. The old gravel pit west of town? Empty. The bridges over Grady's Creek? Clear. Even the Forest Service cabin 10 miles out, abandoned for decades, was checked. Despite no logical reason, a school bus would end up there. But logic had already failed. That's the thing about disappearances. They don't need to make sense. They just need to happen once. Locals stayed out all night. Lanterns bobbed through the dark. Some people searched with rifles slung over their shoulders, more out of instinct than fear. No one said it, but everyone was thinking the same thing. Buses don't just vanish. And men like Albert Granger don't just leave. When Wednesday arrived and still nothing had turned up, the official tone shifted. The language became careful. Words like incident were replaced with investigation. Media interest picked up. Reporters from Salem and Eugene started circling. The town's first and only missing bus case had now become a regional mystery. And still, no brake marks, no license plate, no bodies. Just questions on paper and quiet on the road. It came late on the second day, almost as an afterthought. A man named Wallace Kane, mid-70s, wiry, sharp-eyed, called the sheriff's office from his farmhouse near Old Briar Road. His voice was steady but urgent. "I saw the bus," he said, "not yesterday, Monday, the day it vanished." Kane's property sat about 6 miles southwest of the bus route, near a stretch of land no one had flagged on the original search grid. He wasn't someone prone to drama. In fact, most folks considered him to be a little too blunt. But he was respected, and he was certain. Around 8:40 a.m. on October 12th, he claimed to have seen a yellow school bus moving slowly past the edge of his property. "Didn't make sense," he said. "Didn't belong there. That ain't a road people take unless they mean to." The bus, according to Kane, was traveling down a narrow, overgrown access road that hadn't been maintained in years, once used by service trucks back in the 60s when the county still managed the reservoirs. It led toward a chain of small lakes and abandoned spillways near Briar Lake, a place locals mostly avoided. Not because it was haunted or cursed, just forgotten. Deputies responded within the hour. They found the road Kane had described, barely visible beneath a mess of roots and vines, but no tracks, no disturbed brush, no plastic shards, no skid marks. Whatever vehicle had gone down it, if any, had left no sign. Still, it was the first real lead. Search teams pushed deeper into the surrounding woods, combing the lake edge with metal detectors and sonar. Divers went into the water, slow and methodical. Visibility was poor, less than 3 feet in some places. The lake bottom was soft, silty, and easily could have hidden something large. But over 2 days of searching turned up nothing. No chassis, no fragments, not even a dropped hubcap. Kane's sighting was never confirmed or disproven, but it stuck. Locals began to whisper about the lake, how deep it really was, how long something could sit at the bottom undisturbed. The mystery now had a direction, not a solution, just a place to look, and even that was something. By the end of the week, the search had gone from desperate to surreal. No footprints, no wreckage, no answers. And in a town like Halter's Ridge, where people built their lives on routines, front porch honesty, and knowing everyone by name, the absence of reason felt almost supernatural. With nothing left to go on, the stories began. It started as whispers over poker tables and gas station counters. Then the threads unraveled online, early message boards, amateur sleuth forums, chat rooms. Theories multiplied like vines in the dark, feeding off confusion and silence. Some said Albert Granger had planned it, that the man everyone thought they knew had orchestrated his own disappearance. Suicide, maybe. A final act of quiet control. But if that were true, why take the bus? Why leave no note? And why not drive into the reservoir where they would have at least found something? Others speculated about foul play. Maybe someone had been waiting for him, a hitchhiker, an escaped convict, a drifter with a vendetta. Halter's Ridge didn't have a murder rate. It barely had a parking meter. But still, people began double-locking their doors, pulling their kids closer at bus stops. The idea that Albert had been taken was somehow easier than believing he had simply vanished. Then came the stranger theories, the ones shared in hushed voices after a second glass of whiskey. The government had silenced him. He'd witnessed something on the route, something he wasn't supposed to see. Military transport, toxic dumping, a covert operation on Briar Lake. It sounded like nonsense, until you remembered that Kane's old access road led to an abandoned water testing facility, long since shuttered without explanation. Rumors fed on the vacuum. The town library's microfiche records saw more traffic that month than in the previous 2 years combined. A handful of kids started a Find Granger zine. People talked about electromagnetic anomalies, ley lines, even UFOs. A hunter swore he saw lights above the lake the night of the disappearance. He couldn't describe them, but he couldn't forget them either. Without evidence, the theory should have collapsed under their own weight. But instead, they took root. Because in the absence of truth, the only thing more powerful than fear is imagination. Albert Granger was the kind of man who seemed like he had no secrets until people started looking. At first, the investigation stayed surface level, work records, DMV history, tax returns, all clean, no debts, no priors. His bank account showed a lifetime of small-town simplicity, modest savings, routine purchases, nothing unusual. But slowly, cracks appeared. A week into the case, a deputy doing a courtesy check on Albert's home made a curious discovery. In the living room, the familiar framed photo of his late wife Eleanor sat where it always had, except this time the glass was missing and the picture inside had been carefully removed. It wasn't in the trash, it wasn't in the drawers, it was just gone. Then came the P.O. box. It wasn't listed in his name, and it wasn't in Halter's Ridge. It was 2 towns over, under a rental alias, G.R. Allen. Inside, investigators found mostly junk mail and nondescript manila envelopes, some empty, others containing handwritten letters without signatures. One was addressed to a D with the line, "It's happening again," just like before. No one in town knew what that meant, or who D was. No relatives with that initial, no coworkers with that name, no explanation, just that note. Then the bank records turned. 3 weeks before his disappearance, Albert made 2 large cash withdrawals, $2,000 each, far more than his usual activity. The money wasn't used to pay bills. It didn't go toward repairs or a loan. It was simply withdrawn and never seen again. Even stranger, one of his neighbors mentioned something in passing that had gone overlooked at first. He used to get packages, she said. Manila envelopes, always after sundown. Same delivery guy, but not USPS. When pressed, she couldn't recall a return address. He never opened them right away, she added, just set them by the back door, like he was waiting. It didn't make sense. This was Albert, the man who brought thermoses of cocoa to the crossing guard on cold mornings, the man who fixed a kid's broken bike chain without asking for thanks. But now, he wasn't just a missing person. He was becoming a question, a blank space in the shape of someone everyone thought they knew. By the end of October 1992, hope had been replaced by protocol. The search for Albert Granger, once a town-wide effort marked by flashlights, flannel, and faith, had become an exercise in filing cabinets and phone calls. The leads had slowed to a trickle, and each one seemed colder than the last. The lake had been searched 3 separate times. Divers swept the deepest coves. Sonar mapped the bottom. Nothing. The forest surrounding Old Briar Road was combed for miles in every direction. No tire tracks, no disturbed soil, just wilderness and wind. The letters from the P.O. box were passed to a state analyst. Handwriting inconclusive. No fingerprints, no DNA. Even the reference to "it's happening again" was brushed off as personal paranoia. Without context, it was just scribbles on paper. Then the FBI stepped in, but not for long. A single agent, 2 weeks. They reviewed the case file, checked for links to larger crimes, vehicle theft rings, interstate abductions, missing persons from nearby counties. They found none, no matches, no patterns, no reason to escalate. The official note in the file read, "Low probability of federal interest, no indicators of foul play or criminal network involvement." The last call to the tip line came on November 14th. A trucker claimed to have seen a yellow bus near the Nevada border. Investigators followed it, just in case. It turned out to be a converted camper, painted to look whimsical. A retired couple lived inside, blissfully unaware of the town still waiting 2 states away. By winter, the posters began to peel. The school district ordered a new bus, quietly replacing number 38 in the lineup. It was never spoken of again in morning announcements. At the depot, Albert's coffee mug was placed in a cardboard box and left on a shelf in the break room. Nobody threw it out, but nobody touched it either. The official ruling was filed the week before Christmas. Unsolved disappearance. Subject presumed dead. Cause undetermined. No funeral, no body, just paperwork. That's how mysteries end in places like Halter's Ridge, not with answers, but with silence so thick it begins to sound like closure. By 2012, Albert Granger had become a footnote, something you remembered only when the weather turned or you drove by the depot and noticed the empty bay that never quite felt right. A few locals still mentioned him at coffee shops, mostly older folks. They'd tilt their heads, squint toward the tree line, and say things like, "Still strange, huh?" Then they'd fall quiet again, as if the memory itself had teeth. The town had moved on because it had to. Kids who once rode bus number 38 had grown up, moved away, started families. Halter's Ridge Elementary had been renovated twice, and the new buses came equipped with GPS and dash cams. The school even installed a new depot, sleek, sterile, metal-sided. The old one was now a storage shed used mostly for spare tires and rusting signs. Albert's house sat vacant for nearly a decade before being sold at auction. The new owners tore down the porch swing, painted the siding. The town clerk quietly cleared his name from the property records. No ceremony, just deletion. That's what happens when a person disappears for 20 years. They stop being a person. They become an absence that eventually gets paved over. The Missing Persons Bulletin had long since been archived, filed under G with a dozen others like it. He wasn't special anymore, just one of many who vanished into America's long, quiet spaces, where things slipped through cracks too small to measure. But even in that silence, the mystery still lingered. Some still wondered, late at night, where he'd gone. Others assumed he'd found a way out, of grief, of loneliness, of something darker no one ever really understood. And some believed he'd been taken, not by force, but by something stranger, something that watched and waited and chose. Then, on July 14, 2012, two divers exploring Briar Lake, a place mostly known for its murky water and abandoned fishing docks, made a call that would jolt Halter's Ridge awake. "Dispatch, this is Echo Team," one of them said, voice crackling over the radio. "We've got something down here. Big, metal. Looks like a bus." It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a training exercise. Just two friends, former Navy divers turned recreational explorers, blowing off steam in the kind of place most people forgot existed. Briar Lake wasn't exactly scenic, muddy water, overgrown shoreline, and the kind of silence that made you double-check your own footsteps. Once a gravel pit, it had been flooded decades ago and left to rot under layers of silt and algae. No trails, no boat ramps, just a broken fence and a locked gate that no one really checked anymore. Ethan Mace and Darren Holt had been diving together for years. That Monday, they slipped into the lake with full tanks, underwater lights, and zero expectations. Depth was estimated at 35 feet in the center, visibility low. The sun was high, but the water swallowed the light quickly, turning the descent into a slow gray fade. 10 minutes in, Darren spotted it. A glint. Not fish, not rock. Something unnatural, angled, reflective, out of place. He blinked against the murk, tilted his light down, and froze. It was a corner, a structure, metal, box-like, painted once long ago. He signaled to Ethan with a fast 3-beat flash of his dive light, the kind they used when words were pointless. The two swam lower, cutting through clouds of sediment. The shape began to take form, massive, rectangular, rusted through at the edges. A roof? A side panel? It was hard to tell, buried so deep in muck it looked fossilized. Ethan brushed back a curtain of weeds and revealed something unmistakable. A row of broken windows. They hovered in place, hearts pounding. Then Darren saw it, just barely, just enough to make his stomach lurch. Faded yellow paint under a film of algae. And beneath that, 3 block letters, almost unreadable in the grime, stenciled in flaking black. R.I.D. That was all he needed. Darren surfaced first, yanked off his mask, looked straight at the shoreline and said, "We just found a school bus." The response wasn't immediate. 2 divers claiming to have found a bus underwater in a forgotten lake. It sounded like a misunderstanding. A piece of old equipment maybe, a barge, a dockhouse. Even the sheriff who took the call seemed unsure until the photos arrived. Low-res, grainy but unmistakable, the rusted roof curve, the side ribs, the frame that matched exactly what every kid in Halter's Ridge had once ridden to school. It wasn't just any bus. It was a bus, and that meant something was very, very wrong. The lake was cordoned off within 24 hours. Dive teams from the state's search and rescue unit were flown in, backed by forensic techs and local deputies. News trucks rolled into town for the first time in years, setting up just outside the broken fence line. Residents watched from behind sunglasses and picket fences, too stunned to speak, but not surprised. Not really. They always knew the silence had teeth. The extraction took time. The bus was lodged beneath nearly 6 feet of packed silt and lake sediment, waterlogged, crushed slightly along one side as if it had settled there with a slow, dragging slide. Every window was shattered. Weeds coiled through the seats like veins. The roof had collapsed inward just enough to twist the emergency hatch into a jagged mouth. But it was what they found inside that stopped the recovery crew cold. Bone fragments, not a full skeleton, just pieces, scattered near the back row, a femur, a rib, a jawbone, and beside them an old pair of glasses. They didn't need DNA to guess. The frame matched the exact prescription Albert Granger had worn for 40 years. His optometrist had the records. There was no mistaking it. The bus was real. The man was real. The mystery, the one that had haunted Halter's Ridge for 2 decades, had just surfaced from the dark, and it was only beginning to speak. The call came through at 3:46 p.m., routed through the county dispatcher's desk like any other non-emergency report. A diver, calm but insistent, said he had something authorities needed to see, something buried in Briar Lake, something metal, big, yellow, and old. The dispatcher asked for clarification. "It's a school bus," he said. "Pretty sure it's been down there a long time." There was a pause, the kind that lives between disbelief and dread. "Like a full-sized one?" she asked. "Full-sized, number still visible, broken windows. There's stuff inside." Within an hour, a sheriff's deputy was on site. He didn't go in the water. He didn't need to. The divers had already marked the location with a buoy and provided video footage. It wasn't grainy GoPro footage or vague shapes in the murk. It was clear enough to freeze the blood in your veins. Yellow paint, rounded roof, bus windows blackened with silt, a metal carcass from another lifetime. At 5:15 p.m., the deputy radioed it in. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. We've got a confirmed submerged vehicle. School bus, likely vintage 1980s. Location is Briar Lake, northeast quadrant. Possible remains inside." The silence on the other end was brief. Then the tone shifted. "Copy that, Unit 4. Stand by. We're escalating this." By sundown, word had spread across Halter's Ridge like wildfire. Nobody had to say the name. They already knew. There was only one missing bus in the town's history. One man whose face still lived in yellowing yearbooks and the corners of old photographs. One ghost whose route had ended without an explanation. Albert Granger. Is it him? Was the question being whispered in kitchens, gas stations, and bars? Did they really find it? Outside the lake's gate, vehicles began to line the gravel shoulder. Locals, journalists, deputies. People stood in quiet clusters, arms folded, sunglasses hiding disbelief. Some just stared at the water, like maybe, if they waited long enough, it would give something back. A few said nothing, just nodded, tight-lipped. They weren't surprised, not really. They were just waiting to see what else the lake was ready to reveal. At dawn on July 10, 2012, Briar Lake looked less like a forgotten pit and more like a crime scene waiting to be unearthed. Police tape fluttered along the tree line. A mobile command unit sat parked near the broken fence. 2 search and rescue tents had gone up overnight, along with a generator humming beneath the rising sun. The lake, flat and still, reflected none of it. Crews began arriving before breakfast. Divers in dry suits, forensics in gloves. A crane truck from the state's emergency recovery team pulled up just before 8 a.m., tires grinding against packed dirt, its long hydraulic arm already creaking in the morning heat. The extraction wouldn't be quick. 20 years underwater meant rust, weight, and sediment had claimed the vehicle as one of their own. The recovery was delicate. Chains were looped beneath the frame by divers who worked in silence, murk swirling with every movement. The bus groaned as it shifted, metal twisting in protest, like something reluctant to return. When the crane finally began to lift, the lake erupted in a bloom of mud and algae, thick and black and ancient. The vehicle broke the surface slowly, rising like a carcass from a grave. Water poured from the shattered windows. Weeds clung to the axle. One of the rear tires, still miraculously intact, spun lazily in the air before slapping down with a wet thud against the crane's steel bed. People gasped, cameras clicked, and then came the silence, heavier than before. Reporters from 3 stations were now on site, broadcasting updates in front of hastily assembled lights. The headline ran by noon. Missing school bus found after 20 years. Possible human remains inside. Locals watched from the tree line. A few older residents wept. One woman crossed herself. A teenage boy snapped a photo and immediately regretted it. By afternoon, the bus had been fully extracted and placed under a sealed forensic tent for initial processing. Only a handful of people were allowed to look inside. Deputies, a state coroner, and a forensic anthropologist flown in from Portland. What they found confirmed what most already feared. Bones, tattered fabric, and a name tag, water-damaged but barely legible, clinging to the collar of a decayed bus driver's jacket. A. Granger. The mystery had resurfaced, and it had brought company. The smell hit first. Not rot. Time had taken care of that. But the thick, metallic sourness of long-soaked decay. The kind of odor that clings to your throat and doesn't wash out of clothes. As the forensic team peeled back the twisted emergency door and stepped inside, the air changed, heavier, charged, like something had been waiting. The interior was a time capsule of corrosion. Mold bloomed on every surface, ivy wove through shattered windows, and rust curled the edges of once plush seat backs into jagged metal ribbons. Years of underwater pressure had warped the floor, pushing it upward in places like the bus itself had tried to exhale, and scattered among it all, relics of a life frozen mid-motion. Near the middle row, a pair of orthopedic shoes. Near the back, the skeletonized remains of a human body, slumped over as if asleep. Bones had disarticulated, some settling into seat wells, others tangled in fabric. The skull was intact, the jaw crooked. And just beneath the collarbone, caught in the folds of decaying polyester, was a glint of gold, a wedding ring engraved on the inside. Igi to agi, tidzenkilen shazhat banketto, Albert and Eleanor Granger. But it wasn't just the bones or the ring that silenced the team. It was what surrounded them, laid carefully on 4 different seats, 1 front, 2 middle, 1 rear, were neatly folded articles of children's clothing, each piece perfectly preserved by lake silt, a sweater with ducks across the front, tiny sneakers, a faded backpack with a goosebumps patch still clinging to the flap. No sign of children themselves, just the remnants of presence. It made no sense. No children were on the bus that morning. Albert had been alone, confirmed by school logs, confirmed by security footage. Yet these items sat arranged like memorials or offerings. A chill crept through the inspection tent. Somebody whispered he wasn't alone, but no one answered. Because sometimes the dead leave behind more than bones. Sometimes they leave arrangements, patterns, messages that don't speak in words, but in absence. And deeper in the bus, sealed tight under 2 decades of rust and silt, the glove box remained shut. Whatever it held had stayed there in the dark, waiting. It took hours to pry it open. The glove box door had rusted shut, sealed by time and pressure and neglect. Technicians had to chip away layers of oxidation with fine tools, careful not to damage whatever might be hidden inside. The air in the bus was already thick, tense. Every movement echoed like it mattered. When the latch finally gave, it didn't pop. It groaned. A long, aching sound like a voice forced to speak after years of silence. Inside was one item, a folded, water-warped sheet of lined notebook paper. No envelope, no seal. Just a single page, yellowed and soft at the edges, crinkled like dried skin. One of the forensic analysts used tweezers to ease it out, laid it flat on a plastic board, and scanned it under light. The ink had bled in places, blurred by years in the lake, but it was still legible. A note, handwritten, and unmistakably Albert Granger's. To whoever finds this, I'm sorry. It wasn't supposed to go this way. I thought I had time. I thought I could fix it. But they came back. Tell Eleanor I tried. I really did. If they let you leave, burn the bus. Don't let it sleep again. No signature, just that. The words didn't read like a suicide note. They read like a warning, a confession twisted by fear. Investigators tried to make sense of it, matching the handwriting with samples from Granger's personnel files. It was a match. But the meaning? It made no sense. Who was they? What had he tried to fix? And what did he mean by, if they let you leave? It was the kind of message that leaves more questions than it answers, a riddle dressed as closure. And for those who stood inside that bus, gloves on, boots and ankle-deep silt, the feeling that settled over them wasn't satisfaction. It was dread. Because Albert Granger had left a story behind, and it was only now starting to tell itself. And somewhere in that lake, or deeper, something else had been left behind too. At first glance, the note felt like a goodbye, the kind of letter left behind by someone cornered by guilt or fear, trying to stitch a final message out of unraveling thoughts. But the more they read it, the more it seemed wrong. Not in tone, but in structure, like it wasn't just meant to be read, it was meant to be deciphered. The paper was lined, the kind found in school notebooks. Ink smeared, but deliberate. Each line short. Some phrases circled, others underlined 3 times, violently enough to tear the damp page. They're still watching. I can feel them, even here. The bridge is the last place they can't cross. Once you go past it, there's no turning back. I was supposed to keep it closed. I failed. Burn the bus. Don't let it sleep again. It wasn't the language of a man saying goodbye. It was the language of someone terrified. Someone trying to warn without being too obvious. Someone who didn't want certain words on the page, or who feared someone might read them that shouldn't. The investigators called in a forensic linguist from Portland. She analyzed the syntax, the sentence structures, the shifts in tone. Her preliminary conclusion was chilling in its own right. This isn't suicide ideation, she said. This is paranoia, but highly organized. Whoever wrote this wasn't unraveling. He was hiding something. When she was asked what she thought the bridge referred to, she didn't answer right away. Instead, she pointed to the second to last line. I was supposed to keep it closed. Doors keep things out, she said. Bridges let things in. Theories started forming fast. Was Albert referencing a real location? A psychological threshold? Some kind of ritual boundary? It felt like folklore, except this wasn't carved in stone or passed down by campfire. It was ink, paper, and 20 years of silence. The most unnerving part? Every expert agreed the handwriting matched Granger perfectly, which meant whatever he believed completely. And if he was right, the bus wasn't just a vehicle. It was a gate. By the 3rd day of the recovery operation, the question no one wanted to ask became impossible to avoid. How did a full-sized school bus get to the center of Briar Lake without anyone noticing? There were no tire tracks, no drag marks, no evidence of heavy equipment. The only viable road in Old Briar Access was too narrow, too overgrown, and hadn't been maintained since the 70s. Even if someone had tried to drive it, it would have left ruts, snapped branches, something. But the foliage was undisturbed, the trees intact. No sign of mechanical passage, and certainly no signs of a vehicle large enough to tow a 10-ton bus into the woods. Theories floated fast and ridiculous. Was it airlifted? No records showed any helicopters in the area. Was the lake deeper back then, connected by a larger waterway? Topographic maps said no. One officer joked darkly, maybe it was put here, not brought here. And then someone asked the real question. When did it get there? The official date was October 12, 1992. That's when Granger vanished. But the condition of the bus, how deeply embedded it was, how the silt had formed around its undercarriage, suggested it had settled slowly, over years, not months, not days, as if it hadn't just been driven in, but absorbed. A retired forest surveyor was brought in. He'd mapped the region decades ago and knew the terrain like old scars. When shown the current path to the lake, he shook his head. No way a bus got through that. What about back then? Someone asked. The man paused. There was an old timber bridge over the northeast ravine, he said. Collapsed in '85. Wasn't on any maps after that. But if someone rebuilt it, even temporarily, they found remnants of wood planks buried beneath moss and stone, half-rotted, weathered, long since collapsed again. But enough remained to suggest someone had made a bridge, just long enough to get something across, just long enough to bring something in. And no one, not one soul, remembered seeing it happen. Which begged the real question. Whoever put the bus in Briar Lake, did they want it found? Or had someone just failed to finish hiding it? It took 2 weeks for the tests to come back. The bones pulled from the rear of the bus were in poor condition, partial, water-worn, fragmented, but enough remained to run dental comparisons and DNA extraction. The molars were a match. So was the mitochondrial DNA, cross-referenced with a tissue sample from a preserved envelope Albert Granger had licked and mailed in 1987. The remains were his. Albert had been found, after 20 years. But identifying the man was only part of the mystery. What came next raised even more questions. There were no signs of blunt force trauma, no shattered ribs, no skull fractures, no defensive wounds, nothing to indicate a struggle, no gunshot, no knife, nothing. It looked, by all accounts, as though he had simply stopped living. But the real shock came from his lungs, or what was left of them. In the chest cavity, forensic pathologists recovered trace particulates, fragments embedded in tissue, locked in microscopic structures that shouldn't have survived 2 decades of decomposition, but they had. And when tested, they revealed a startling detail. The particulates didn't match Briar Lake. The water Albert had inhaled, the water that likely ended his life, wasn't from the lake the bus had been found in. It came from somewhere else. Higher iron content, no traces of agricultural runoff, no algae consistent with Briar's ecosystem. Whatever killed him, if drowning was the cause, happened before the bus sank, or somewhere nearby, in a different body of water entirely. This discovery reframed everything. Was Albert already dead when the bus went into the lake? If so, who put him inside it? And why stage it like a burial, a sealed tomb underwater with preserved clothing and children's items that didn't belong? Investigators tried to match the foreign water sample to other nearby lakes and wells. Nothing lined up. It was like the water had come from nowhere. Or worse, from somewhere people weren't meant to go. What had started as a recovery was now an active investigation. And as divers returned to the lake for a final sonar sweep, they prepared for closure. What they found instead was another body. The sonar pass started out routine. The visibility was poor, as expected, murky water filled with drifting silt and rotted vegetation, but the divers knew the patterns now. They'd mapped every corner of Briar Lake across 4 days, every contour of the floor cataloged and processed, which is why the anomaly stood out immediately. 50 yards northeast of the bus, near the lake's deepest channel, a diver's scanner pinged on something dense, human-sized, and partially buried beneath a collapsed drainage grate. A rusted storm pipe, unmapped, undocumented, jutting from the lake's edge like a forgotten vein. The grate had buckled inward, its bolts wrenched loose long ago by time or force. The diver signaled up. A second descended to confirm. What they saw was unmistakable. A human skeleton curled into the mouth of the drain, arms tucked like a child trying to stay warm. The bones were mostly intact. The skull faced outward, mouth slightly agape. No clothes remained, just a single chain still clinging to what used to be a neck vertebra, silver, with a tiny charm in the shape of a lunchbox. It wasn't Granger, and it wasn't recent. When they pulled the remains out and ran preliminary dental checks, no matches came up. But the age range was clear, late 40s, male. Estimated time of death? Between 1990 and 1995, which placed it right in Granger's window. This was someone else entirely, someone who had died around the same time, someone who had been buried not in plain sight, but hidden, wedged deep into a drainage system that hadn't been touched in decades. And if the bus had taken 20 years to surface, how long had this body been waiting? The discovery shifted the investigation from bizarre to something far darker. Who was this second man? Why had no one reported him missing? And was he connected to Albert Granger, or to whatever had been watching from the trees that day in 1992? For the first time, detectives began using a word they'd been avoiding: staged. Because this wasn't random, this wasn't accidental. This was intentional, and Briar Lake had more secrets to give. The remains recovered from the storm drain were sent to the state medical examiner's office. Standard procedure. But everything that followed was anything but standard. No ID was found on the body, no wallet, no license, no military tags, just the necklace. And even that was nondescript, a lunchbox charm, possibly custom, possibly nothing. There were no tattoos, no surgical implants, no scars identifiable on the bone, The tissue was long gone, dissolved by years of water and time. Dental records? Useless. The man's teeth didn't match any known missing persons from the region, or even from the broader national database. A full forensic dental sweep came back blank. DNA was pulled. First, a familial match search, then an expanded net, then, reluctantly, a last-ditch attempt to use consumer genealogy tools. Still nothing. Not a single match in any system. It was like this man had never existed. Even the cause of death was inconclusive. No blunt trauma, no signs of bullet wounds or knife damage, ribs intact, skull undamaged. The only anomaly? Microfractures in the hands and wrist bones, possibly defensive, or perhaps the result of squeezing into the storm drain under duress. The working theory? He'd hidden or had been placed there. Tox screens were impossible. No soft tissue remained. But forensic anthropologists noticed something strange about the bone marrow. Traces of sediment that didn't match Briar Lake. Again, just like with Albert, the water inside him came from somewhere else. Somewhere unknown. They were no closer to learning this man's name, but they were now convinced of something else entirely. He wasn't the first victim, just the first to be found. The state coroner, reviewing the evidence late one night, wrote a short line in the official report that never made it into the press. 2 ghosts in one lake. One wrote a warning, the other said nothing. Maybe because whatever found him didn't leave him time. Halter's Ridge had always had stories. Small towns like it tend to. Folklore passed down between generations like cautionary bedtime tales. And for decades, kids in the area whispered about something in Briar Lake, though no one ever agreed on the details. Some said it was a woman who'd drowned there in the 40s. Her body never recovered. Others said it was a miner who'd vanished when the gravel pit flooded. But the most persistent version, told mostly during sleepovers, campfires, and hushed walks past the tree line, was the one that came up in police notes after the second body surfaced, the lake ghost. According to the story, it was a figure that appeared near the water's edge when fog rolled in thick. Pale-skinned, wearing clothes that didn't match the decade, sometimes a woman, sometimes a man, always standing still, watching. The ghost didn't chase, it waited. And if you went near the water, especially alone, it pulled you under. Not with violence, but with something worse, compulsion, like your feet moved on their own, like you wanted to go, like it had already chosen you. Most wrote it off as kids' nonsense, just a spooky story to scare newcomers or keep teenagers from partying by the shore. But now, in the wake of 2 recovered bodies, a submerged bus, and a cryptic note mentioning them watching, the town's collective memory started to shift. Newspapers dug up old articles. A woman in her 80s came forward to say her brother vanished near the lake in 1984. He said something was calling to him, she whispered. I thought he was drunk. He never came back. Another man swore he'd seen headlights near the water at night. No road, just lights, moving slow, hovering above the surface. People began looking at Briar Lake differently, not as a quiet backwater, but as a place where time folds, where things go missing and something watches from the dark. Maybe the stories were just stories. But maybe not all legends start from lies. Some come from things towns are too afraid to say out loud. And now those old whispers were screaming. The tape surfaced almost by accident, buried not in a crime lab or evidence locker, but in the back of a cardboard box stored inside a retired officer's basement under decades of dust and silence. Tom Lafferty had served as a patrol officer in Halter's Ridge for over 30 years. He wasn't one for dramatics, kept to himself after retirement. Never spoke much about the Granger case, except to say it had never sat right with him. But after the bus was pulled from Briar Lake, something gnawed at him. He remembered a call, vague, routine, from early 1993, a break-in at an old utility shed outside the reservoir. Nothing appeared stolen, just a broken lock and a faint chemical smell. Inside they found a dusty TV, a power inverter, and one unlabeled VHS tape. He'd taken the tape home, meaning to write it up later. But the incident got buried under more urgent matters, and the tape ended up shoved into a box marked pending. It stayed there for 19 years. Now he handed it over. Investigators converted the degraded VHS to digital. The image was warped, black and white, grains swimming like static snow, but what it showed made the room go silent. A bus, clearly visible, parked on a narrow patch of land surrounded by water, Briar Lake before it swelled, before it hid what it was never meant to hold. The angle suggested a fixed camera, likely from the utility building. And then, movement. Albert Granger. He stepped off the bus slowly, deliberately, wearing his uniform and glasses. He looked calm. He didn't appear chased or coerced. No struggle, no fear. But there was something wrong. The way he moved, not quite right, too smooth, too precise, like he was gliding just slightly out of sync with the world around him. He walked to the edge of the lake and stood still for 37 seconds. Then, without hesitation, he turned and disappeared behind the bus, into the tree line, and never re-emerged. There was no sound, no timestamp, just the faint warping of the tape like it didn't want to be watched. And one final frame, near the end, barely perceptible, showing a shape in the water, human-sized, watching him, still waiting. After the VHS footage made national news, old names started resurfacing. Forgotten relatives, distant connections, people who had once circled Albert Granger's life but never stood close enough to see its cracks. One of them was Owen Granger, Albert's nephew, now in his 40s, living in Portland. He'd only visited Halter's Ridge a few times as a kid, mostly during summers. He remembered Albert as kind but quiet, always scribbling in notebooks, always locking the spare bedroom before dinner. It wasn't until the discovery of the bus that Owen decided to check the storage unit Albert had left behind in his will, a unit no one had touched in 20 years. What he found wasn't much: a box of bus maintenance manuals, a broken floor lamp, 2 dented thermoses, and beneath it all, a false bottom in the metal locker. Inside, 2 leather-bound journals, brittle with age, locked with rusted clasps. One opened easily, the other had to be pried apart. The entries began in 1990. Casual at first, notes about bus routes, old dreams, memories of Eleanor. But slowly, the tone shifted. The entries became fragmented, nervous, paranoid. A man tracking something not in miles, but in moments. Saw it again today, standing behind the cedar post at mile 12. Still no face, just watching. Kids were silent again. I asked if they saw it. They just stared at me, like they knew. It's beneath the surface, beneath all surfaces. The lake is just the door. Drawings filled the margins, strange spirals, intersecting triangles, a symbol resembling an eye with a vertical slash through it. Repeated, over and over. One page was written entirely backward, as if meant to be read in a mirror. Another included a hand-drawn map, leading not to the lake, but beneath it. The final entry, dated October 9, 1992, 3 days before Albert vanished, was barely legible, a scrawl of panic. It's open now. The bridge was never meant to hold. I shouldn't have remembered. I was supposed to forget. If I go, it follows, but if I stay, it takes you. Owen handed the journals over, but not before taking one photo, one page, one symbol. And that night, for the first time in his life, he dreamed of water he couldn't escape, and something waiting just below the surface. The bridge had always been part of the background, an old timber crossing that connected the northern logging road to the far side of Briar Lake. It collapsed in 1987 after a heavy storm washed out the supports. No one used it by then, and the county quietly removed it from updated maps, out of sight, out of relevance. But after the journal surfaced, especially Albert's repeated warnings about the bridge, its meaning changed. Investigators unearthed archived land surveys, overlaying them with hand-drawn notes from Albert's journal. The alignment was eerily precise. His sketches, scrawled with shaking hands and backward letters, mirrored the real bridge's layout exactly, even the curvature of the supporting beams, and the slope of the southern path. He'd walked it, studied it, feared it. The most unsettling part? Albert's writing didn't refer to the bridge as a structure. He called it something else entirely. The bridge is not wood. It's a line, a seam, a mistake in the map. They can't cross it unless it's open, and I opened it. The theory forming among investigators, quietly, cautiously, was that the bridge wasn't just a way over the lake. It was a way into something beneath it, something that may not follow the rules of topography or physics, something Albert had discovered and tried to contain. Locals who remembered the bridge before it collapsed described feeling uneasy near it. Some claimed their compasses would spin in place while crossing. Others recalled hearing whispers when no one else was around, soft, waterlogged, pulling. When sonar scans were directed toward the bridge's former base, divers found a hollow, an unnatural pocket beneath the silt. Not deep, but too symmetrical to be erosion. Some kind of chamber? A tunnel? A cave? They weren't sure. But one investigator said almost under his breath, "That's not a lake floor, that's a door." And if Albert had been telling the truth, he wasn't the only one who walked through it. The question surfaced slowly, uneasily. Was Albert's disappearance the result of mental illness, paranoia spiraling into obsession? Or had he truly uncovered something ancient, something buried in the land long before Briar Lake was ever named? When forensics returned to the site where the bus had been found, they began scanning the surrounding trees and ground more thoroughly. That's when they noticed it, the symbols. At first, just one. Etched faintly into the bark of a pine at the water's edge, a triangle intersected by a vertical eye. The same one Albert had drawn dozens of times in his journals. Then they found another and another. At least 6 symbols were identified, each carved into trees spaced exactly 10 feet apart, forming a rough semicircle around the shoreline. Some were fresher than others, but all had one thing in common. They were facing the lake, not away, toward. Experts in religious anthropology were consulted. The markings didn't match any known modern faiths or recognized occult traditions, but one researcher, specializing in folk symbology, noted their similarity to boundary sigils, symbols used in ancient cultures to contain or repel forces believed to reside in natural places. They weren't meant to summon. They were meant to warn. Back in town, an old man stepped forward, a recluse who'd lived near the lake since the 70s. He'd seen Albert once, back in 1992, pacing near the edge of the water with a notebook and a string of what looked like bone charms tied to a branch. He said Albert looked afraid, not of someone, but of something. When asked why he never came forward, the man just shrugged. "Didn't think anyone would believe me," he muttered. "I barely believed it myself." But he wasn't crazy. He was preparing. Preparing for what? A ritual? A gate? A thing beneath the lake that watches and waits? Or maybe, just maybe, a boundary that had already broken. And Halter's Ridge was only now starting to feel the water rise. The Granger case had always felt unfinished, but no one expected just how many cracks lay beneath its surface, until someone started asking the right questions. Following the discovery of the journals, symbols, and second set of remains, journalists began filing FOIA requests for documents related to the 1992 investigation. But what came back wasn't revealing. It was missing. Entire sections of the case file were redacted or labeled unavailable. Surveillance logs were incomplete. Field notes from the week following Granger's disappearance were marked as lost in archive transition. One specific line, buried in a dusty intake form, read, "EPA restriction zone, northern perimeter of Briar Lake, no access granted." But the EPA had no record of a cleanup effort in the area at the time. That's when retired Sergeant Dale Rusk agreed to speak, off the record at first. He'd been part of the original search. Quiet, measured, not prone to conspiracy, but when pressed about the EPA notation, he admitted what most had only guessed. "There was no hazmat situation," he said flatly. "That was just the language they gave us." "Who's they?" He didn't answer right away. "We were told to stay clear of a zone north of the lake," he finally said. "Said it was dangerous terrain, but we never saw trucks, no fencing, no signs, just a feeling, cold air, no birds. Compasses didn't work right. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't EPA. He said the entire investigation had been rushed. Granger was declared dead before we even found his watch. They wanted it closed, quietly. And the bus? Not a word about it once we realized it was missing. Just a line in the report. Presumed stolen. No follow-up. No follow-up. On a missing school bus and a man who had no enemies, no history of mental illness, and no reason to disappear. It wasn't incompetence. It was removal. A deliberate effort to steer the investigation away from something. Something beneath Briar Lake. Something someone didn't want found. The second skeleton, recovered from the submerged storm drain, had baffled investigators for weeks. No ID, no dental match, no connection, until a third-party genealogy search finally hit something unexpected. A partial match in a private ancestry database. The body belonged to Daniel Mercer, a 49-year-old high school janitor who had worked at Halters Ridge High for nearly 12 years. He was reported missing on October 5, 1992, just 7 days before Albert Granger vanished. At the time, his disappearance was dismissed as personal. Mercer had no family in town, kept mostly to himself, and was last seen drinking alone at a bar near the reservoir. No signs of foul play, no open investigation, a footnote in local news. A man no one looked for, until now. The match was confirmed through distant relatives in Colorado. Mercer's DNA was a perfect match to the skeleton, same age, height, and a fractured right wrist that matched an old work injury filed in his employment records. The revelation sent ripples through the community. Why hadn't anyone made the connection in 1992? 2 disappearances, 1 week apart, both men employed by the school district, both vanishing near the lake, and yet treated as separate incidents. Investigators revisited Granger's journals. On October 3rd, Albert had written, "He's seen it now. He's not supposed to see. If he speaks, it won't let go." 2 days later, Mercer disappeared. Then came a chilling discovery. One of the symbols carved into the trees near the lake matched a doodle found etched in pencil on Mercer's custodial clipboard, still preserved in the school's lost and found storage. Nobody had noticed it before. Suddenly, Mercer wasn't a stranger to the story. He was part of it. And if Albert's writings were to be believed, Mercer may have seen something he wasn't meant to, and paid the price. Now 2 men were dead, and the lake's silence no longer seemed like peace. It felt like a pact. In the end, the story of Albert Granger and Daniel Mercer may never be fully known. But when the pieces are laid out, the missing bus, the submerged remains, the journals, the symbols etched into trees and scratched into clipboards, a theory began to emerge. Uncomfortable, incomplete, but compelling. The final report, filed quietly in late October 2012, listed it as a possible shared act of concealment and/or ritual behavior. What that meant in plain language was this: Albert and Daniel knew something, or did something, and it led them both into the lake. Some investigators believed they were involved in a cover-up, something tied to the school or the land, or even something much older. A secret buried beneath layers of official silence. Others believed it was a suicide pact, born of guilt or delusion. The journals hinted at something pressing, something coming, and Mercer's disappearance days before Albert's suggested a timeline built not on impulse but plan. Then there were the darker interpretations. Cult behavior, obsession, some ritual neither of them fully understood. The symbols matched no known tradition, and yet they were repeated with intention, precision. As if Albert believed, truly believed, he was holding something back, not escaping it, containing it. Forensics confirmed the bus had been positioned deliberately. It hadn't crashed. It hadn't sunk randomly. It had been driven into the water with control, parked in the deepest channel, and sealed like a tomb. Why? To hide the evidence, or to lock something in? The theory fractured even further when you accounted for the missing time, the altered water in Albert's lungs, the unexplainable footage of him walking calmly into the woods. Had he been running from something? Or toward it? The file was closed with no charges, no cause of death, just a list of names, a GPS coordinate, and a short final note. Event concluded. Driver deceased. Associate deceased. Motive unknown. But in Halter's Ridge, no one used the word concluded. They used another buried. The bus is gone now, burned per the instructions in Albert's note. The county approved a controlled fire, supervised by environmental specialists. It took 4 hours. The metal twisted and screamed under the heat, groaning like something alive. A final, reluctant exhale before becoming ash. They didn't let cameras film it. No public ceremony, no press, just fire and silence. And when it was over, the lake looked the same. But no one goes near it now. The paths are overgrown, the shoreline is silent. Kids in town cross the street rather than walk along the fence. And even the birds avoid flying directly over the water. The official record says the case is closed. But the questions haven't stopped. Why did Albert Granger believe he had to seal the bus? Who, or what, was he writing about in his final journal entries? Why did Mercer disappear just days before him? And why was he never connected until decades later? What was the bridge? What was watching? And most importantly, why did both men seem to believe that if they left it alone, others would be spared? Was it guilt, grief, delusion? Or was it a quiet act of protection we'll never fully understand? Locals still talk, softly, carefully. Some believe Albert was a hero. Others think he lost his mind. A few are sure it isn't over, that the lake was just one chapter, that what began there has only shifted to somewhere else. But no one's gone missing since, not yet. And the lake? It hasn't offered anything else. It just sits there, reflecting the sky, holding its silence like a secret too heavy to share. And maybe that's all the closure Halter's Ridge will ever get. Not a solution. Just an ending. For now. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.